Thank you very much for being here today. I'm very excited about our event. Obviously, if you're here, I don't have to tell you that the last 30 years of economic reform in China has been one of the most significant and sweeping economic changes in the world. And increasingly, if you look on the pages of the newspapers today, you know that China's economic clout is increasingly global in scope. And so I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Hank Levine here to speak to the theme of China Goes Global, economic interests, international interdependence, and Chinese foreign policy. We are very lucky to have Mr. Levine. He is currently a senior director with the Albright Stonebridge Group, which is a strategic advisory firm in D.C., and he helps international firms deepen their understanding of China and engage in governmental relations there. Prior to joining the Albright Stonebridge Group, Mr. Levine spent 25 years in the Foreign Service. He twice served in the U.S. Embassy, as well as U.S. Consul General in Shanghai. He has also been a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia at the Commerce Department, and he was Senior China Advisor to 2 Secretaries of Commerce and a lead negotiator in the annual U.S.-China Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade. So I think he is uniquely positioned to talk about China's economic development, its global economic interests, and all types of issues related to commerce in China. So I would also note that he has also been very gracious with his time. Tomorrow, for any interested students, he will be having an informal discussion all about China and careers in foreign service and foreign policy think tanks. That will be from 9 to 10:45 in the CCI library of the Adirondack House. So any interested students, I encourage you to show up. So he will give a talk, and then we will have a lengthy question and answer session. So we appreciate your interest and hope that you will prepare your most insightful questions for Mr. Levine. All right, thank you very much.
Good, thank you. I'm going to set a little timer here. I'm one of these people who always says I'm going to try to be brief, and then I go on and on, so you have to be careful. So I'll try to keep a little bit track of the time. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I should first of all thank the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in New York, who will, of course, be bringing the live feed with Secretary Albright later. So I need to thank them, but also Middlebury and Orion in particular, who has been just wonderful. We got rained out last year, but made it here. Let me say, particularly delighted to be here because Middlebury looms so large in the China field. I have many friends who got their start in the Middlebury Summer Intensive Language Program. It was legendary in the China field, frankly. I even have friends who taught in the program early on. Beyond that, let me say I hear it's a pretty good school more broadly as well. So I'm really delighted to be here. And both my kids have been attending liberal arts colleges, so I will say we're also huge, big fans in our house of the liberal arts education, the kind of education you all have here. So delighted really to be here. I'm going to try, and it'll take a lot of self-control, I'll try to limit myself to 30 minutes or so. So we do have quite a bit of time for Q&A. And in my initial comments, I'll speak rather broadly. I am certainly not going to try to march through all of the hot-button key issues that we all read about and here. I'm going to try to sort of speak at a somewhat higher level of abstraction and give what I think of as some context or framework in thinking about China and the world and a little bit about U.S.-China relations. But I do that with the hope and the expectation that when we get into the Q&A part of the session, you all will feel free to raise whatever issues that are on your mind with regard to China. And then I can be sure also that we're spending a lot of time on the things that interest you the most. And I've been told you're really bright and well-informed and you're going to have tons of questions, so don't let me down. Let me start by saying a little bit about kind of the importance of China. And we all know China is a big, important country. But, you know, a little bit over a year ago, I was at an event in Washington where John Huntsman spoke, former ambassador to China, former presidential candidate. It was right after the horrible event of where the U.S. ambassador and 4 other Americans were killed in Benghazi, Libya. And Huntsman spoke about that, and he talked about terrorism, and he talked about sort of the Middle East and the Arab Spring and so on. But he went on to say that in his view, when we reach the end of the 21st century and historians are writing about this century, the biggest story they will be writing about will be the rise of China and the development of U.S.-China relations. Needless to say, I have some sympathy for that point of view, although let me hasten to add that I am not one of those people who believes that China is going to become the next superpower, that China is going to eclipse the U.S. in terms of economic influence or military power, political influence, soft power, innovation and technology. I don't believe that for at least as far out as we can see. And when we get into the Q&A period, we can talk about that. In my view, there are a number of economic, political, and even cultural elements that come out to play. But having said that, China is already a major power, and it is getting more important. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that we are living through an historic period, the rise of a major new power in the world, even if China, as I say, does not eclipse the U.S. To put that more concretely, though, when we think about China, I guess I would say that there is no other single country in the world that is as important on as many issues that Americans care about and people around the world care about as China is. I think the European Union would probably qualify, but that's, of course, a collection of a number of countries. What do I mean by that? To be very concrete about it. Well, suppose some of you I know are seniors, you're going to be out looking for jobs. Maybe you're really focused on the state of the global economy and economic growth and jobs. Well, as we know, China is the second largest economy in the world. It's the second largest importer in the world. It's the largest exporter in the world. It's the largest manufacturer in the world. It has more people on the internet than any other country. On and on. You can't manage the global economy and see sustained global economic growth unless China is a piece of the puzzle, unless you're working with China. Maybe, though, your focus is more on climate change, energy, pollution. Well, China, a couple of years ago, of course, overtook the U.S. to become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We're all familiar with the terrible pollution in China. Not only has that pollution now been tracked across Japan, it's also been tracked over to the west coast of the United States. Recently, U.S. government issued some data indicating China has now become the largest oil importer in the world. China looms very large in the energy picture. So again, in climate, in energy and environment, China looms large and has to be a part of any solutions. Maybe, though, your focus runs more toward non-proliferation, the spread of missile technologies, nuclear weapon technologies. China has all these technologies. In the past, it's had a somewhat spotty record in controlling them. In recent years, much, much better. But again, you can't have strong global non-proliferation regimes unless China is a part of the system. Regional problems, North Korea, Syria, Iran, China looms very large, either because of its relations with the individual countries or simply because it's a member of the UN Security Council and it can block UN action. So again, have to work with China. China looms large. Global health problems. Some of you may remember SARS. Recently, more recently now, issues of bird flu. Right now, in fact, wrestling with a new strain of bird flu in China, the H7N9 strain, which has killed 35 or 40 people. Many of these viruses originate in China, or in any event, because there's so much travel in and out of China, you can't deal with the issue of global pandemics and health issues unless China's a part of it. Food and product safety, everything from tainted drywall in houses to tainted dog food. Most recently, reports of tainted dog chews that have killed apparently several hundred dogs in the United States possibly, I don't know if this is confirmed, source from China. Blood thinner. Recently, a Chinese company purchased Smithfield Foods, the world's largest producer of pork, and a lot of debate in Washington as to whether this would put U.S. food supplies at risk, having a major food company owned by a Chinese entity. We can talk about that. Full disclosure, Smithfield Foods is a client of my consulting work, but happy to talk more about that. Anyway, I could go on and on with the list. Counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism. China's not the biggest player in those areas, but there is cooperation between the United States and China in both of those areas. Alien smuggling, trafficking in persons, and then, of course, finally, human rights. For better or for worse, depending on your perspective, human rights has always been a part of U.S. foreign policy. Many Americans care about the human rights situation in other countries, and obviously, if you care about human rights around the world, China is a big area of focus. So, in other words, as you can see from this list, when we think about China and its impact, it's not just another big country, not just another important country. It really, really looms large in so many areas of concern. So, okay, against this backdrop then, what is it China's leaders are trying to do as we see them going out to their companies, as we see China itself becoming more active in the world? What is it they're trying to accomplish? And I guess there are a lot of ways to think about that. I would sort of break it down into three goals for the purposes of discussion. And the first one is, I think, obviously the Communist Party wants to maintain itself in power in China. Now, I would hasten to add that there are a lot of different ways for a single-party government to try to keep itself in power. I think the Kim dynasty in North Korea has gone about it in one way, keeping the country closed, keeping people poor, relying very heavily on repression. I think the Chinese Communist Party has gone a different route, and the fact is, as I think many of you know, today in China, the legitimacy of the Communist Party comes not from some love of communist ideology by the people of China, but rather primarily from the fact that the Communist Party and the Chinese government have been able to deliver economic results, that people have seen their own lives, their kids' lives getting better and better. I think nationalism probably plays into it as well, and we can talk about that, but fundamentally, I think it has been delivering economic results. Of course, the government in China will use coercive power when it needs to, but it's not their preferred method by any means. And again, we can talk more about that. I think the two exceptions might be in border regions, Xinjiang and Tibet, where there's a greater readiness, I think, to use coercive power. But overall, when we see these demonstrations in villages across China, the preferred method is not coercion. It is rather going in and buying people off and paying them to go back home. So the first point then is, I guess, as we think about what China's trying to do, Communist Party wants to maintain itself in power, and fundamentally this has an economic underpinning. Second goal, in my view, and I think that many of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party are sincere in wanting to improve the lives of the people of China. And oh, by the way, they got a pretty good track record. I guess the UN says China has lifted something like 500 million people above the poverty line. I think they're sincere in that, many of them. Now, it does link to the first goal that I mentioned, which is keeping the Communist Party in power, but I think that there is a genuine interest in improving the lives of the Chinese people. And again, you'll note that this second goal also relates to economic growth and economic development. The third goal, it seems to me, is the leadership wants China to be strong and respected in the world. Strong, I think, for the Chinese. I think the Chinese leaders have in some ways been wiser than some of our political figures in the sense that they understand that in today's world, being strong economically is at least as important as being strong militarily. And so the very heavy emphasis, of course, in China has been on strengthening the economy. Again, economic growth, economic development. And the path they have taken, and this is significant, and I'll come back to it. Of course, the path they have taken for economic growth is one which is highly integrated with the global economy, whether it's foreign investment coming into China or Chinese companies going out. And so they have understood that in the quest to be strong and respected, the economic side of it is very important, and that involves integration in the global economy. And this is, again, part of the reason we see Chinese companies going out, investing in resources. We can talk about that more. I think, by the way, that this doesn't bother me or scare me. I think, in fact, a lot of these state-owned companies probably are overpaying for the assets that they're buying. And furthermore, I think they overestimate the extent to which, if they own the mine, that they really have control over the product and the situation. Again, we can talk more about that, but this is driven, again, by this notion China wants a strong economy and wants to be strong. I would say that, though the emphasis is on the economy, there is a military aspect here. And in fact, I guess I would say that the desire to be economically strong and to be integrated globally helps drive some of China's military development. And as China has become heavily reliant on imports of oil or other resources shipped in over long distances, surprisingly, China's not happy to say, is not content to say, we'll just let the U.S. Navy guard the sea lanes of the world and ensure the flow of resources to us. Their attitude has been, we'd like to develop the Blue Water Navy capability to protect the inflow of resources through these sea lanes of communication. Furthermore, as their companies have gone all over the world and invested, they want to be in the position to do what we do in the United States. If U.S. citizens get caught up in a civil war somewhere, they want the ability to be able to go in and repatriate their citizens, protect them on the ground. So the desire for a strong economy and a globally integrated economy has certain military implications. But as I say, I think that the heavy focus has been on the economy. And furthermore, while the military developments, of course, give a lot of people concern, this integration into the global economy is an enormous moderator of Chinese behavior and a constraint on Chinese behavior. The Chinese government is very aware that they need economic growth for several of the reasons I've already mentioned, that economic growth depends on trade and investment, whether it's Chinese exports or investment coming into China, and that requires at least decent relationships with its major economic partners, the U.S., the EU, and yes, I think even Japan. Imagine, for example, a military action by China. I have felt for many years that the likelihood of Chinese military action against Taiwan was exceptionally small. Not because we got a bunch of pacifists, sitting in the Politburo Standing Committee in Beijing, but because I think they clearly understand how terrible it would be for China's interests. I mean, what would happen if China attacked Taiwan? Well, the U.S. Congress would go berserk. Today, we take about 20% of China's exports. There'd be enormous immediate economic sanctions on China. The EU would probably follow suit. Japan would probably follow suit. Foreign companies would be nervous about investing in China at that point. They might pull out investment or postpone investments. An enormous negative economic impact on China, which, as I say, really goes to all three of the goals that I've mentioned: staying in power, improving the livelihood of your people, and being a strong country. So in my view, China's integration in the global economy is a moderator of China's behavior. Finally, let me say, although we talk about China wanting to be strong and respected, I don't see China as an expansionist power. They are not the Soviet Union, excuse me, of the Cold War. They are not Nazi Germany. They are not embarked on a global domination, a worldwide domination. And again, we can come back and talk about that. They want to be active both politically and economically around the world, but not, as I say, expansionist in the sense of some of these recent historical examples. All of this, I think, brings us to the question of U.S.-China relations. So let me say a few words about that. As you can see from the list of important issues involving China that I started with, I think you can see that the way that U.S.-China relations develop has enormous significance for us. In other words, if China and the U.S. wind up in a situation of hostility where the two countries are trying to cooperate as little as possible, we're obviously much worse off than if the two countries have a relationship where they are trying to cooperate as much as possible. And so I think this is the real, the real issue. The overlay here is the historical overlay, and many people now have written about the historical phenomenon where an existing power like the United States meets up against with a rising power like China, whether it's Sparta and Athens or whether it's Great Britain and Germany in the early part of the 20th century. Often that phenomenon results in hostility and even war. And so the challenge is to see how we can develop the relations between the U.S. and China, avoiding those worst kind of outcomes. Personally, I tend to be optimistic that we can avoid the worst outcomes if we work hard at it. One of the factors is the issue of economic interdependence, which does have a moderating impact. I mentioned the impact on China. It's true in the United States as well. And I'll just give you one statistic, and we can talk about the economic relationship in boring detail. I'm happy to go into it. But just to give you one set of numbers that I think is underreported and underappreciated. As you all know, we buy a lot more from China than we sell to China. However, the selling side is an unbelievable story. And the fact is that in the period 2003 to 2012, U.S. exports to the rest of the world outside of China grew by 111%, which I thought was a pretty good number. It turns out that U.S. exports to China in that same period grew 294%. U.S. exports have been going through the roof. Interestingly, I looked up, if any of you have an interest in this, the U.S.-China Business Council does a study every year of U.S. exports to China. They break it down by state and by congressional district, actually. And I looked at Vermont. It turns out in that same period, Vermont's exports to the rest of the world went up by 45%. Vermont's exports to China in that period went up by 1,751%. Today, China is the third largest export market for the United States after Canada and Mexico. And the $109 billion of merchandise exports that we sent to China last year supports a lot of jobs here. So you hear a lot of noise and screaming and yelling in Congress and elsewhere. The fact is there's some enormous positives in the relationship. And as I say, I think that's a moderating factor on both countries, but helps to stabilize the relationship and gives some cause for optimism about the relationship. Now, having said that, we know even though there are benefits from the relationship, countries can act stupidly, they can make mistakes, and they can wind up in a hostile situation with each other. And so it's important that we think about how can we avoid that outcome. And fortunately, the leaders of the two countries are spending quite a bit of time thinking about that. The catchphrase that's being used, it was started by Xi Jinping when he was vice president in China. The catchphrase is building a new kind of great power relationship. In other words, getting out of this historical phenomenon where the existing power and the rising power come into conflict, but finding another path forward. This was, by the way, a major topic of discussion when President Xi and President Obama held their informal summit in June in California. So the key element, I think, in this is to understand that we have competition, we have points of friction, but we also have a lot of areas where we need to cooperate. And it's important, I think, to keep in mind that we are always going to have an ambivalent relationship with China, at least as far out as I can see. And so the challenge is, though, which dominates in the relationship? The contentious, sort of negative competitive aspects or the cooperative aspects? And that is very much, I think, a question, but that really is sort of the key issue. As I mentioned, the summit in June was very useful, actually, between the two presidents. Unfortunately, right after that, Edward Snowden, fled to Hong Kong and then was allowed to leave Hong Kong and released all this information about U.S. spying, including spying on China. And that certainly created something of a bump in the road, although not, I think, a permanent fatal bump. But the fact is, even before Snowden, there were a number of important hurdles to be overcome in the relationship. And the fact is, I think, over the past 6 or 7 years, under the previous leadership team in China, under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, there was a significant issue of growing mistrust between the two countries. On the Chinese side, a strong sense among many officials and ordinary Chinese that the United States wants to contain and weaken China. And in fact, they viewed the Obama administration's rebalance towards Asia or pivot as a central reflection of that policy. They saw the pivot as aimed at China, which frankly, I honestly do not believe that it was. On the U.S. side, several factors have increased mistrust in Washington toward China. One, China's growing military capabilities, as I mentioned. I'll be honest in saying some of the concern that's pumped up about China's military capabilities may relate to budget issues in Washington, particularly, in the war against terror, the Army and the Special Forces have done pretty well budget-wise, but the Air Force and the Navy need a really big enemy to justify expensive weapon systems, and I think there may be some of that at play, but nonetheless, China's growing military capabilities has increased concern. Second, China, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, has become, I think, more assertive internationally, or some might say more aggressive in promoting its interests, including, for example, with regard to the islands in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and that's raised concern. Number 3 is the issue of cyber spying, which is to say really the theft of commercial information by the Chinese government over the internet through computer intrusions, and that's had a very significant impact both in the government and among major U.S. companies, a very big factor in mistrust. And then finally, I think it's fair to say that the policy environment in China for foreign companies, including U.S. companies, has become more complicated and a little more difficult in certain ways. That has increased concerns in the business community, which has traditionally been one of the biggest supporters of U.S.-China relations, and so some additional complexity there. Having said all of that, let me just say since March, since the new leadership formally took over their positions at the National People's Congress in March, I think it's fair to say we've seen some positive movement. In the national security area, there's been a significant increase in military-to-military exchanges, something the U.S. has wanted for a long time. I think this is something that came out of the Xi-Obama summit in California. Second, I think there's a sense that China is trying to move back in the direction of negotiations with regard to the South China Sea Islands issue. In the economic area, we've seen a number of positive changes, and again, we can talk in a lot of detail. I think we've seen very strong statements by the leadership on their intention to pursue significant economic reform and opening, further access for foreign companies, and that's very important in the political sphere in Washington. It plays out in a very positive way. Two specific things which we can talk about: progress in negotiating a U.S.-China bilateral investment treaty, and this announcement of this new Shanghai Free Trade Zone, which is supposed to be an experimental area testing very even more significant economic opening, and again, we can talk about that. Third, I think China has shifted somewhat its position on the regional trade negotiations. In particular, it's now talking in a much more moderate and interested way about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP negotiations, which it used to say was another part of the U.S. plot to exclude China, but they've come around to a more positive or potentially positive view on that. And so, as I say, I think we're seeing a number of positive steps on the economic side. As I think many of you know, we're building toward the third plenum of the Communist Party Standing Committee in November, at which time we are expecting to see the announcement of a package of economic reforms. And I think once we see that, we'll be able better to judge how successful the leadership is in overcoming opposition and delivering on very substantial economic reform and opening. But they've created some expectations. So going forward, you know, look, I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. We're just not sure exactly how the relationship will play out, but I think a couple of things are clear. One, the U.S. and China are facing enormous challenges, which will be easier for both of us to manage if we're trying to work together to the maximum amount possible. Second, there will always be competition and mistrust in the relationship, but as I say, the bottom line for me is that I remain cautiously optimistic that we can maintain friendly relations while managing our differences. I think it's going to take hard work on both sides. And in particular, I hope that many of the students in this room will be devoting themselves to tackling that task, because I truly believe there is nothing more important to be working on in the world today. So thank you. With that, I'll finish, and I look forward to questions.
In regards to cyber war and cyber theft, how soon do you see kind of like the materialization of international laws and regulations and norms regarding that? And do you think China will be actively participating in those kind of talks, or looking to continuously operate under the status quo of a more ambiguous system or the absence of those laws?
Yeah, I think my sense is that international norms and agreement are probably a pretty long way off. And bear in mind, by the way, just to sort of clarify this issue, you know, what the U.S. has been saying, and it's become a much more muddied and a more difficult issue to explain, but bear in mind that what the U.S. has been saying is, look, every country is a source of some cyber crime, you know. Every major country is breaking into computers of other countries to do what I call traditional spying, stealing political secrets, stealing military secrets. The distinction with China is, the U.S. has been saying, the distinction with China is, in addition to those things, China is doing something else. China is the only country in the world that is engaged in such a massive effort to have government-affiliated entities breaking into the computers of purely commercial companies, stealing information that is purely commercial, that has no military or political significance. And they're the only countries doing it. So the focus in the U.S. bilateral discussions, at least from the U.S. side, the effort has been to focus solely on that issue and explain to China, you're the only country that's doing it. Now, let me hasten to add that it's well known that there are some other countries that do some commercial espionage. People usually mention France, sometimes Israel, Taiwan. But China, I think it's fair to say, China is the only country that is embarked on this in such a massive scale. So in terms of U.S.-China relations, the most important thing is trying to get that issue. It's a narrow but tremendously important issue, trying to get that under control. That is, I think, going to continue to be addressed on a bilateral basis primarily. And the hope is that over time, the Chinese government at senior levels feels that it's giving them a black eye, and it's and tries to send messages down through the system to rein in that kind of activity. I mean, I think that's the hope that the U.S. government has, and we can talk, if anybody's followed the history of non-proliferation controls in China, in the 80s, Chinese companies were selling chemical precursors and missile-related technologies, and often senior people in the government didn't really know, and it was out of control. And over the course of many years, through lots of complaints and arguments and so on, the central government has managed to have in place a much stronger set of controls on exports of sensitive technology. And a friend of mine who works over at the National Security Council has made the argument that that's kind of maybe the model that we would hope for on the cyber theft issue. Senior levels over time become so concerned that they get some more controls. So that's a bilateral issue. The problem is, of course, complicating all of this is a whole set of broader international issues, and in particular, this whole question of the future governance of the internet. And a lot of debate over whether the U.S. should continue to dominate control over the internet. Now, up until Edward Snowden, it was a lot easier for the U.S. to argue that, well, it's a good thing that we mainly dominate the internet, and most of the servers that assign internet names are in the United States because we're open and transparent and we don't cheat people and we're fair. That argument, obviously, as the NSA is now, as we know, tapping into every, communication around the world, that's become a lot more difficult. And so, in other words, in U.S.-China bilateral relations, the big deal is the cyber commercial theft issue, and the two sides are trying to work on that. The broader set of international issues, I think, has just gotten more and more complicated. And I guess, my feeling is broader international agreements are going to be a longer time coming.
So I read an article in the New York Times the other day about, it was a kind of a piece about a Filipino outpost on an island in the South China Sea, and how they were slowly getting surrounded by more and more fishing boats and more Coast Guard patrol boats of the Chinese. And I was wondering you seem to think that you view the Chinese government as being more willing to talk these issues out and negotiate over them. Well, to me, it seems like they're getting more and more aggressive about lands that they think are theirs, or that they use the historical arguments to say they're theirs. So I'd like to hear what you think about how they're more willing to negotiate, or if they are more willing to negotiate in the South China Sea region.
Yeah, I think the broader trend here, if we go back in time, you go back a number of years, and there was a period when China was on what people referred to as a peace offensive, and they were talking with the ASEANs in particular and discussing. I guess there was agreement on principles for a code of conduct and discussion of eventually negotiating a code of conduct. At one point, there was discussion of sharing exploitation of resources in the area and so on. And then I think, some of this coming out of the aftermath of the financial crisis and some domestic factors in China, we saw the tone in China turn, I think, much more aggressive, or you might say belligerent. And the result was, by the way, a lot of the ASEANs, really got scared. I was talking with a group of U.S. naval officers not that long ago, and they were commenting on how over the years, how much easier it's gotten to get permission for military overflights or basing of U.S. warships in the ASEANs, because China really spooked them. My sense is that over the last 2, 3, 5, 6 months, the Chinese have again been talking more about returning to the issue of a code of conduct. And someone here, maybe Orion or somebody knows even, I guess, I don't know if talks are scheduled, in fact, but more recently, the Chinese have once again been emphasizing, can't we somehow try to resolve this through negotiations? Now, having said that, they are not going to back down from their positions. They're not going to do anything that would appear to cede on the principle, that would appear to enforce the legitimacy of Philippine claims, of Japanese claims in the East China Sea, and so forth and so on. So in that sense, they're going to continue to be firm in that. But I don't see that so much as the issue. I mean, the issue is, over time, can the parties involved reach some kind of an accommodation that allows frictions to decline over the longer run? Short term, the frictions are going to be there. By the way, I would argue, though, that there really is a limit here. Again, the danger is miscalculation or accidents. I mean, we had this some years ago when a Chinese fighter jet bumped into one of our surveillance planes, right? And a whole big mess out of that. And these kinds of things happen. But I am absolutely convinced that certainly Beijing doesn't want to take military action in the South China Sea nor in the East China Sea, again, for the reasons that I talked about earlier. I mean, it's just not in their interest. So the frictions will be there. They will send their ships. They will stand firm. And part of the problem here is, I don't follow this as closely as some other people do, but I've heard a number of colleagues in Washington who follow this, who make the argument that the latest round of friction with Japan over the East China Sea was precipitated by the Japanese, right? And the Japanese government decided to buy the islands because that was better than the alternative of having the crazy Tokyo governor by themselves. But nonetheless, you can argue that it was the Japanese who kind of upset the status quo. Well, as soon as that happens, the Chinese are going to react, and they're probably going to overreact, right? So just to say that, yes, the Chinese will continue to be firm, but my sense and my understanding is that if we look at even recent weeks and months, the Chinese rhetoric and the approach has tried to kind of tack back toward more of a negotiated approach. Let's try to work things out. I think the issues are going to be with us a long time. But I think that it's a positive if the Chinese are somehow trying to ratchet down, at least on the rhetoric, though they will be firm in terms of where their ships go and stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, follow up.
So you'd say that it was more incited by the Japanese buying the islands than the coincidence of the Chinese having their first aircraft carrier around the time that the Japanese... and when the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyudao issues kind of came to the surface and were at their height in the Chinese and Japanese media.
Yeah, my sense, and I will be the first to say I'm not as deep on this issue as others, but I'm convinced by comments I've heard by a number of colleagues in Washington who I think are balanced in their views and look at this in detail, that the precipitating action came from the Japanese side. Now, it's not to say the Chinese have handled it well or done, good things and so on. And again, an argument could be made that the Japanese government in buying that was trying to avoid a worse outcome and so on. But, from the Chinese perspective, that doesn't help. I mean, if you're sitting in the Politburo Standing Committee, right, the last thing you want to do is be accused of being soft on Japan or soft on the island. So if one of the other parties, and I've heard people assert, and I really don't follow the details, that even the Philippines has been in some ways, the precipitator of the problems here. So, and you put Chinese leaders at that point, if anything happens, they absolutely have to react, and they probably have to overreact. And oh, by the way, it's even worse than that, because as you know, there are, a dozen different Chinese agencies that are involved, the maritime shipping, the Coast Guard, the this and that, and it's highly decentralized, and they're not communicating well. They've recently tried to rationalize this into one overall agency, and I guess Xi Jinping personally has taken control. So they're trying to get some control, but if another country does something, it's just going to precipitate an action. I'm not excusing the Chinese, and I'm not saying they're blameless in any of this, but I think an argument can be made in the most recent round with Japan in particular that the change in the status quo initially came from the Chinese side. The fact that the Chinese have their aircraft carrier now, and we could talk about, the U.S. has 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, right? And that's like dozens of ships surrounding them. And this is a separate issue, but the whole question of how worried we should be about the one, retrofitted Chinese aircraft carrier is another issue. But I do think that I guess I'm convinced that Japan probably precipitated it, not intending to provoke the Chinese, but and the Chinese will react. They absolutely will. Yeah, a bunch of questions. Well, yeah, if you've got one right there, good.
Okay, I just have a general question about the business environment for Western or U.S. companies doing business in China. So obviously, during your time in Shanghai and China, you definitely had a lot of opportunities to communicate with a lot of business leaders for the foreign, like Western or U.S. firms. What is their biggest concern of doing business in China? And does their kind of general sentiment get better or worse during the Hu era? And are they more optimistic about the Xi reform or the new government? Thanks.
Yes, if we talk about the biggest concerns of let's say, U.S. companies, and frankly, similar issues for all of the big multinationals, whether they're U.S. multinationals or European or Japanese, I would divide the concerns into two parts. Today, actually, many of the biggest concerns they have don't have anything to do with policy issues. The biggest concerns are rising costs in China. It's getting very expensive to produce in China, or a lot more expensive than it used to be. In fact, they say today wages, along the coast in China, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and so on, are similar to wages in Mexico. And if you produce in Mexico, of course, you don't have to ship stuff across the Pacific. And furthermore, Mexico has a free trade agreement with the U.S. Stuff can come and do it. So rising costs are one big operational business issue. A second operational business issue is competition for workers, for talent at all levels. I mean, white-collar, sophisticated managers. And then even at the factory level now, we're seeing labor shortages, and it's tough to get enough people and then retain them. Chinese workers, particularly in the managerial and white collar, there isn't a lot of loyalty usually, to the business employer. And if another company offers a few more dollars a month, people tend to make the transition and move over to make more money. So you have a set of operational issues, which I think are at the top of the list when they survey business companies. But on the policy side, I think the story has been, there have been two issues have always been a problem for foreign companies in China, and this is speaking very broadly. One is the lack of fair and effective implementation of laws. As many of you may know, China is a society still in which relationships often are more important than laws. And the poster child here is intellectual property. So if you're the head of the local police force, the head of the police in a small city somewhere, and there's a factory producing counterfeit batteries, right? Well, that's illegal, but maybe you went to high school with the head of the factory, right? Or maybe they're a relative, or maybe they're paying you off. I mean, maybe corruption's involved, but even short of that, you are inclined, it is very difficult for you to crack down and enforce that. And so one broad problem that foreign companies have had is this lack of fair and effective enforcement of laws. And as you can understand, for many multinationals, their attitude is, tell me what the laws are, and I really will try to comply with them because I operate all around the world. I follow, I got Peruvian law, I got Australian law, I really will. But in China, we have this very awkward, difficult situation where lots of local Chinese companies and competitors have relationships in the government, whether it's central or local. They're doing things that they're getting away with, and then the multinational. So one is this issue of fair and effective enforcement of laws. The second issue is what I would call unhealthy relations between government and business, Chinese government and Chinese companies. And as I think you know, here in the U.S., our system is far from perfect. I mean, far from perfect. However, our regulators, if you look at the Food and Drug Administration, even the Securities and Exchange Commission, they try to have an arm's length approach. And whether you're a German company or a Chinese company or a U.S. company, they try to apply the rules and laws fairly across the board. Well, in China, Chinese government entities at the central, provincial, and local identify very closely with Chinese companies. And in fact, it's formal. If you look at the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, on the one hand, they're the regulator, much like the FCC in the US. On the other hand, they have an explicit responsibility to promote the Chinese industry, the Chinese IT industry, to help and protect Chinese IT companies. And so you have this kind of relationship that, again, makes it very difficult for foreign companies. So those two issues have been with us a very long time, and I think it'd take a long time to fix. Over the who-when period, two new issues evolved and developed. One is the cyber spying issue, which has really concerned people. But the other was the sense that during the Hu-Wen administration, when China joined the WTO, it began to implement its commitments. And as a result, the Chinese government was starting to be less involved in micromanaging the economy and getting into commercial issues. The sense is that over the Hu-Wen period, the Chinese government again began to become more involved. And they implemented a variety of policies aimed at helping Chinese companies and putting foreign companies at a disadvantage, particularly in the high technology and advanced manufacturing area. And we can talk, if people have an interest, use of unique technical standards, government procurement, a variety of issues. So there was a sense that the Chinese government had become more activist in favor of Chinese companies. Today, the big question when the transition came to Xi and Li Keqiang, the big question was, would they continue or would they try to revive economic reform and opening, which many Chinese economists feel had pretty much withered. Today, there is a lot of guarded optimism. There is a sense that the Xi administration is talking very aggressively about economic reform and opening. They've done some things already, but as I mentioned earlier, I think the next milestone will be the plenum in November, the Central Committee plenum, because that's when the new set of economic reform and opening measures are supposed to be rolled out. So I would say today there is guarded optimism in the U.S. business community that things are going to start to get better. And primarily, as I say, getting the Chinese government out of deciding so much stuff and allowing decisions. And by the way, Premier Li Keqiang has been very definitive on this. I mean, he has said, we need to have more and more things decided by companies themselves on a sort of a market economic basis and less decided by the government. This, by the way, also feeds into the anti-corruption drive, by the way, right? If the government is less involved in having to issue permits and approve things, then there's less opportunity for corruption. So guarded optimism is where we are today, I think. Yes, who has the microphone? Good, you want to do one back on that side?
You intimated pretty early on in your speech, that you don't see as bright of a future for the Chinese economy as a lot of people do in terms of them overtaking us or anything of that nature. And you said you would expand on it later if anyone asked. Would you like to expand on it?
Nah, not really. I was lying. But no, I'm just joking. Yeah, and again, I mean, we have to separate out several things. The consensus view, and I'm not an economist, and certainly the consensus view is of people who I take seriously anyway, is that China will continue to grow. Clearly, China's economic growth is slowing, and now they're talking, 7.5% this year as opposed to 10% a year over the past decade. If you look at the World Bank and others, they're saying once you start to get out 5-10 years, you're looking at 4% growth, maybe something like that. So the economy, it has to slow. I mean, an economy can't keep growing. So there's that. Related to that is of course, the idea that someday China's economy will be bigger than the U.S. economy, and people give different dates for that, when that's going to happen. So at an aggregate level, China's economy will be bigger than the U.S. economy. Okay, fair enough. I'm not sure. I guess my view is that doesn't mean very much. The Chinese, of course, will always hasten to add that even when that happens, of course, on a per capita basis, the U.S. will still be much wealthier and much better off than China is. But here's the issue. If we're talking about economic influence, and again, this question came up about a year ago. It's a different group of military officers, also for the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And someone posed the question, said, gee, China increasingly is becoming the major trading partner let's take, for a lot of countries, including in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, doesn't that give them an enormous amount of leverage and clout now? And these countries are exporting a lot to China. I said, I don't see it. And this is why I actually got into this discussion. Look what's happened in ASEAN. I mean, as China has become the biggest trading partner and in some cases the biggest export market for these countries, I don't think we could say that we've seen these countries, suddenly turn pro-Chinese and anti-American or pulled away from the U.S. Quite the opposite. As they say, when they feel their national security interests are at stake, they welcome U.S. port calls or permanent docking of ships and so forth and so on. So being, the economic relationship, in my view, in and of itself does not tell us anything about political influence. The mistake I think people make here, by the way, is, there are still people around who reason from the Cold War. The Soviet Union had economic satellites. It had satellite countries. A place like Cuba or Mongolia, they were totally dependent on the Soviet Union. So yes, when the Soviet Union told them to do something, they pretty much had to do it. But that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking here, if you're talking about China and ASEAN, you're talking about trade, mutually beneficial trade. One of our clients is Western Digital, the people who make hard drives. They are the largest employer in Thailand, and most of their hard drives get exported up to China. Now, and they get exported to Dell factories in China or Hewlett-Packard or Lenovo or Apple. Does this mean because Thailand exports all these hard drives to China, does that give the Chinese some leverage? If the Chinese say, we're not going to take your hard drives, wait a minute. They don't take those hard drives, what are those factories going to do? Those factories are going to shut down. The workers are going to be unhappy. They're going to demonstrate. That's a problem for the Chinese government. So on the economic side, I guess my view is growing trade and investment relations does not necessarily translate in any way into meaningful political influence. Now, at the margins, yes. And I already said, I think China moderates its behavior because it realizes how important economic relations are. And I think the U.S. moderates its behavior. The Congress moderates its behavior towards China. So at the margins, there's something to it. But the model of a dominant China like the Soviet Union, I think it's totally wrong. Then we get beyond that, and we probably want to move on to other questions. But you look at innovation. I mean, this is a huge big deal, and the Chinese government is bound and determined to become an innovative society, is the expression that Hu Jintao used. And become a tech leader, and it's just not working. I mean, it really is not working, as many in the Chinese system recognize. And I think, you talk about issues of an educational system which emphasizes rote memory rather than creativity. You talk about a top-down system. The 12th five-year plan has targets for the number of patents to be issued in China by X year. Now, think about that for a minute. A target for the number of patents. I thought a patent it's a creative process when somebody invents them. How do you set a target for patents, right? Well, of course they do. And of course the target will be met because people pump out really crummy patents in order to do it. But it's not, the whole innovation system is very heavily skewed toward top-down government committees handing out money and so on. And then on top of that, of course, we have the issue of weak protection of intellectual property rights. And how can you have a truly innovative society if people are free to, or are able to steal a lot of intellectual property from each other? So, and then finally you get into the issue of soft power. How many people around the world really sort of admire Chinese society? I mean, would prefer to live in China? And again, I mean, I'm not anti-China, and I've lived there, and I enjoyed living in China. But when we think about societies around the world looking at China as a model for how I would like my social system, my legal system, my governmental system, I don't think that many people around the world. So bottom line is China's economy will be bigger than the U.S., but I'm not sure that means anything else. I think there are a lot of other constraints on China. Yeah, why don't we come down to the front here so these people don't feel left out.
Hi. So we've done a lot of talking about sort of the external sphere and looking at international relations, but I wanted to move the conversation a little bit more domestic. You talked earlier about sort of how North Korea has used a lot of repression to keep control over its state, whereas China, with the exceptions of perhaps Tibet and Xinjiang, has largely moved away from that. But I wanted to sort of pick your brain on internet censorship and looking at sort of changing internet usage in China and sort of the creation of a whole parallel social networking system. And I just sort of wanted to see if you thought there was room for change for that in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, to clarify my earlier comments, number one, as I said, I mean, the Chinese will use military force, police force, coercive force when they feel the need to do so. I guess the statistic, and I've lost track of this because people used to report every year. The latest, what was the latest? The Chinese government reported 150,000 riots and demonstrations across the country a year, maybe, or 180,000 in the most recent reporting on this. And it's been going up significantly. And the vast majority of those, as you know, they're economic concerns, and they are not put down by force. They're put down by local officials who are told to go out and talk people out of it, tell them to go home, give them some money to help make up for their losses. So that was the context. As I say, I think Xinjiang and Tibet, much more complicated and so on. But information control, I mean, clearly the trends have been negative. That includes over the Hu-Wen era, and I think we could argue the negativity, if that's the right way to say it, has accelerated recently under Xi Jinping. Now, the interesting question is, what does that tell us about the future? And what does that tell us about what does that tell us about what's going to happen in the future? Bear in mind that Xi Jinping is thinking he's going to serve 10 years, barring some, unexpected activity. And that's not just 2 years, it's 2 5-year periods, because he's currently working with an existing Politburo Standing Committee. And as you know, I think when they slimmed down the Politburo Standing Committee, and of all of the potential candidates for the Politburo Standing Committee, it turns out the ones who got it, other than Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, were the oldest people who were potentially candidates for the Standing Committee, which maybe is not that surprising in the Chinese system. I think there was a sense they had seniority and they were due. So he's working with an existing Politburo Standing Committee for the rest of this first 5-year term. He's then going to have a different Politburo Standing Committee in the next 5 years. Now, I am not saying that Xi Jinping definitely wants to bring political change to China, that he wants to loosen up on internet censorship and so on. All I say is, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. And to me, one significant factor is, as I mentioned, clearly he and Li Keqiang are making a very big push on economic reform. And as you know, there are enormously strong vested interests who are fighting them tooth and nail. Now, if I were Xi Jinping, and I were trying to make big changes on the economic side, the last thing I would do was then start a war with the conservatives on the political side. I might, in fact, be more inclined to say, okay, fine, yes, I'm a nationalist. So, now, maybe he really believes all that stuff, and maybe he will never loosen up. But all I'm saying is I just feel that those who have jumped to a conclusion and already branded him either horrible, or anyone who says, no, definitely he will eventually, all I say is I think the jury is still out. So, it has gotten worse, I think, without a doubt, and I would anticipate it's going to stay at this level or continue to get a little bit worse, certainly for some time. Whether over the 10-year period of Xi's administration, it will ever begin to turn back the other way, I don't know. I certainly hope it does. I mean, I think it's really important, but I don't know. It certainly has gotten worse, without a doubt.
Now, with regard to the increasingly complicated issues on Chinese companies going out, Huawei, for example, has received more hostility than hospitality in the United States for various reasons. Now, bearing in mind of the goals of economic growth you have just mentioned, are there any tangible strategic ways of resolving the imbalance of the need to grow economically and the challenges that Chinese companies face in foreign countries? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and let's just talk about the U.S. first of all. And you mentioned Huawei, the telecommunications manufacturer, which has had a terrible time in the U.S. By the way, I think the views of the U.S. government toward Huawei, a manufacturer of telecommunications equipment, may be a little bit easier to understand once we've now had a look at a number of the materials that Edward Snowden has released, and in which he alleges that U.S. telecommunications equipment manufacturers and other equipment manufacturers, he asserts, have cooperated with the U.S. government to install backdoors or otherwise ensure access for U.S. intelligence collection on equipment that's being sold to other countries. Well, it makes it easier to understand maybe why the U.S. has freaked out over the notion of Huawei, a Chinese company, selling equipment that goes into the U.S. telecommunications network. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. But here's the issue. The fact is that the vast majority of Chinese companies that come and invest in the U.S. never have to be approved or reviewed by the U.S. government. As I think you may know, the only investment review mechanism that the United States has is a committee headed by the Treasury Department called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or CFIUS as it's known. And CFIUS, by law, bases its reviews solely on national security concerns. So indeed, they blocked Huawei sales on national security. They turned down this Chinese effort to buy a wind farm because it was supposedly too close to a U.S. military facility. I'm not sure that was a good decision, by the way, but the point is, I think the number is CFIUS looks at most maybe 10% of Chinese investment coming into the U.S. And if you look at something like the recent purchase of Smithfield Foods by Shuanghui, the Chinese company, stupidly in my view, it had to undergo a CFIUS review. I don't know what the national security, but it was approved, okay, with no conditions. And the government said, okay, fine. So on the one hand, you have to remember that a company like Huawei in a sensitive sector is the exception. The vast majority of Chinese companies come into the U.S., never have anything to do with the federal government. They just get approved. Unlike China, by the way, where you almost always have some kind of Chinese. So we're the most open investment climate in the world of any major economy. That's number one. Number two, though, unfortunately, and I've had the unfortunate experience of spending many hours sitting across, it's not actually the enjoyable experience, many hours sitting across from Chinese government officials, most of which are enjoyable, actually. I have a number of good friends. But one of the things you always get from the Chinese government is, oh, U.S. is unfriendly to Chinese investment, and you turned down Huawei, and you did this and that, and a friend of mine in the Chinese government, who for obvious reasons will remain nameless, said to me, I said, you know better than that. I mean, if you want to talk about Huawei or certain other individual situations, I'm happy to do it, and some of those decisions were bad decisions, but you know as well as I do, I said to my friend, the U.S. overall, it's just not an issue. Why do you keep harping on this? He said, Hank, to tell you the truth, you guys have a long list of complaints about restrictions in our market. We kind of feel we need to mention something. And so I honestly put some of the responsibility for this on the Chinese government. They know better. It's not that big an issue. It's not that big an obstacle in the macro sense. It may be for an individual company. So there's that. Finally, let me just say, and I know we're running up against time, Chinese companies have a lot of learning to do. I mean, the bigger obstacle, in the same way, particularly years ago, when U.S. companies went to China, they didn't understand, I operate in China, it's a very different system, culture, this and that. And you have the same issue today for Chinese companies. And in particular, and I'll finish with this because we're up against time, Chinese companies don't like to pay for intangibles. And the fact is, when you come to invest in the United States, right, we're a country of laws and regulations. And the first thing you got to do if you want to be successful is get yourself good lawyers, good accountants, in some cases good political lobbyists maybe, and so on. And Chinese companies have this sort of broad aversion to spending a lot of money on consultants and advisors. And I have a lot of friends, lawyers, for example, and they have trouble collecting the fees and so on. And Chinese are shocked, the Chinese company, by how expensive it is. And it is, it's outrageous, but you have to do it. So my point is that certainly there are things the US can improve, but I think the Chinese companies have a lot to learn. And this issue of national security review is, in the macro sense, it's overstated. With that, we need to finish. Thank you all very much. I wasn't disappointed. So.